next speaker is someone who hopefully most of you know. Nick Ferreyros is the managing director now for policy, advocacy, and communications at COA. It's like a small job. He's been an advocate for a long time. He's been a communication strategist. Despite his youthful appearance, he has about 2 decades under his belt of doing community advocacy and health policy. And his forte, and you'll see if he lives up to it now, is to translate all of the wonky policy into the language and concepts that policymakers, Congresspeople, us, patients, and maybe most importantly, voters can understand. So Nick, please come on up. Where are you? Oh, there you are.
All right. So this is going to be a quick presentation, what Sarah said, and I'm going to leave on now. Now, Nick Ferreyros, Managing Director, thank you very much for the intro, Barbara. I want to echo what you said when you started. I also am an Avalier fanboy. About half my slides I had to change out because there's so much overlap between what Sarah was going to talk about. But the good news is, you know, her slides will look better, but mine have some memes on them. So, you know, little giggle there. As Barbara mentioned, despite my youthful looks, I have a great skincare routine. I turned 43 in a few weeks. So, you know, there's a lot of experience in DC. I've spent actually more than 2 decades now in DC. I will also couch, you know, there are scary slides in here. I am a pessimist, but really more of a realist sometimes. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt. I'm going to spend a few slides sort of talking about COA, what our priorities are, what we're hearing from practices. Then I'm going to get into the IRA for a second. So for those that don't know about COA or do but are not as sort of intimately familiar with it, we're a national nonprofit that represent independent, non-hospital-based oncology providers. We do sort of a whole laundry list of things. If I tried to list out everything that we are doing, it would go much more than this slide. I have some great colleagues in the room. Fred Schnell, I see you there. We've got Sheila Placencia as well, who runs our practice support. And so, you know, if you're not involved in COA, your teams at your practice are not involved in COA, I highly recommend doing it because as we're going to talk about, as you just heard, there's a lot of challenges on the horizon for community oncology. And COA and, you know, the ONCare Alliance, there is a lot of ability for us as sort of networked groups of professionals and industry stakeholders to make a big difference in this. And there's a lot of learning here for everybody in the practice, sort of on a day-to-day operational level, on the big picture policy level, and then in the weeds of sort of the wonky policy stuff that we need to be engaged in on advocacy. So what are we hearing from practices? This is a lot of words, but you know, the point of this slide is to show you that there is a lot of concern out there for practices. This is an end-of-the-year survey that we do with our CAN, our administrators, and our COPA pharmacy networks. And these are all of the things that they're concerned about. And you know, it runs the gamut from the IRA, it runs the gamut to burnout, workforce, staffing issues, the sort of ongoing managing inflation within the practice, the financial burden. So, you know, there is a lot in the world of community oncology that we are concerned about, that our practices are concerned about, and that we hear about. Boiling that down into what we can focus on, right? Because, you know, you can have a laundry list of things you're worried about. Here are the things that we are focusing on. And I have bad news. This was my slide last year. This is my slide again this year. Because as you'll see in a few minutes when I talk about sort of the reality of politics in Washington, we had probably, you know, a good half of these at least that were on the agenda in the end of year budget bill that we're going to get passed that got torpedoed at the very last minute. And so, you know, we would have seen some tremendous relief going into 2025. And unfortunately, politics, as it always does, gummed up the system and gummed up the progress. But this is where we are focused. On an immediate term focuses, we are focused right now on ending the CMS reinterpretation of Stark on drug delivery, couriering, or patient and family caregiver pickups for orals. advancing PBM reforms, which is really at the finish line, and dealing with some of the hospital issues around site-neutral payments and other things, sort of improving the competitive landscape there. IRA is still, number one, number two, and number three issue, but on sort of immediate what's going to happen in the next couple of months, those are the things that we are focused on. All of this is against a background, you've probably seen slides like this before, anyone who reads drug channels, and if you don't, it's also a great resource in addition to Avalier. These are, we are living in an increasing world where vertical, horizontal integration and alignment is happening everywhere. And that's making the landscape of independent oncology much more different, changing practice behavior, how you have to operationalize things. And so, it becomes even more important when these sort of big existential challenges like the Inflation Reduction Act come into play, because all of the push, the pull, and the pressures around practices right now are impacting how you respond and how you have to respond to that. And so in answering that, one of the things my old boss used to always tell me is, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And so what we did, and actually this was just released yesterday in DC, we put together the Prescription for Healthcare Reform. If you go to communityoncology.org, it's on the homepage, or if you sign up for our emails, even better, you get it directly yesterday. This is a big document. It took about 6 months of work, actually with Avalier and a lot of policy consultants. 50 pages. We go through all of the big five, we tried to organize the chaos into 5 buckets. Hospital and health system consolidation, insurance and PBM consolidation, physician reimbursement and workforce shortage issues, access to drugs, that includes IRA and drug shortages, and then modernizing structural CMS policy. So these are sort of the bigger sort of ingrained CMS Medicare issues that we face. This is a really great resource when you go and look for, well, how do we solve this problem, Nick? Or how do we solve that problem, Barbara? Well, this document sort of synthesizes 10 years worth of policy proposals that Congress has come up with. Every single thing in this, I could do an hour just on all the recommendations in here. Every single one of these ties back directly to existing written legislation in Congress. So the point being there is, you go to the Hill, and on Tuesday we had a briefing on this, a preview for Capitol Hill. We had all the staffers in the room, and you go in there and you're like, are you even old enough to drink? They are so young, and if you've ever been in Washington, D.C., you see that. They are young, young, young. And every year, every 2 years, every 4 years, that the office completely changes over. It is very hard to see continuity in Congress. Usually, I think the average, I used to have a slide on this, the average tenure is somewhere around 3 years in a congressional office. So that means all that institutional knowledge, when you go in there and you're like, listen, so B to D and effectuation and MFP, out the door, got to teach them again. And so, you get someone like Yen, who as a super user comes in with a big chart and, all these Post-it notes, and she's teaching everybody. And that's what you have to do. You have to be there, you have to be present, and you have to teach them. And so what this document tries to do is sort of capture a lot of the knowledge and guidance that we've been telling them over the years and say, like, you want to solve hospital consolidation? Here's some recommendations. You want to solve drug shortages? Here's some recommendations, and here's some bill language that you can use. So very, very helpful document, and particularly when you get to advocacy, which I'm going to encourage you to do in a second. So big picture, Sarah just talked to you about the IRA itself and what it's going to do. I'm going to talk a few slides in there, but big picture here, every single politician in America has run on the promise of lowering healthcare costs. And I put costs in air quotes because it's what they get on the invoice. It's what a patient will get, on an invoice or as a bill when they're done with treatment. If they're lucky when they're done. If not, if you're at some institutions before you can even begin, right? And so that you have to remember that mentality when you go and think about the IRA and all of the policy proposals out there, that cost and addressing costs and lowering costs is literally what they said in their campaign ads. And if you look at all the campaign ads in 2024 for president, Senate, House, they were all talking about lowering healthcare costs. They were all promising lowering drugs. They were all touting the IRA and Medicare drug price negotiations. So going in there and trying to get them to change their mind on this is very challenging. And that's going to be, that is something that we need to remember. Of course, you look at this poll on the side and it's hard to see, but 92% of Americans think that it's important to boost the number of medicines that Medicare negotiates. But then you look at the next 2 slides down, a majority of Americans also think that we need to repeal the negotiations law. So, you try to figure out where everyone's talking out of both sides of their head, and as so much as what's the reality of today in America, it's sort of what's your news source? Where are you hearing those sound bites that are coloring your perspective on things? The good thing about the IRA, there are some good things, and I'll talk about that also. But one of the good things about the IRA is, big pharma, the boogeyman, had its pound of flesh taken out. Now Congress can say, oh yeah, we got Medicare, we got drug price negotiations. So now let's deal with some of the other things in our system, such as hospitals and PBMs. And we were very close at the end of last year. Those conversations are going places. But they feel like they've made a good achievement with the IRA. They certainly don't think their job is done. I think if you listen particularly on some of the more progressive policymakers, there's still a lot of work to be done on the IRA. But now they can turn their attention a little to other issues. Sort of also against that backdrop, I don't need to tell you Washington, D.C. right now is a little crazy. There's a lot going on there. But, politically in the balance of power, the Republicans control, the administration, they control the House, they control the Senate. So they control sort of all the 3 levers of power. And if you consider the Supreme Court the 4th, they also, essentially control that too. So they get to set the agenda, they get to set the health policy agenda, but they have an extremely, extremely slim majority. So that means getting things done requires consensus. And the last time you saw a Republican trifecta, you saw a very similar dynamic play out in which you have sort of these factions within the different parties that get to control the narrative a little bit. They say, I really want to focus on this issue. And if you don't include this in all your bills, or if you don't address this first, I won't support your other bills. So, all that big list of, that laundry list of things that I wanted to do, that sort of end-of-year budget package mess that I talked about, that's colored by all of this, and that you have these newly empowered little factions within there because of the slim majorities that get to dictate a lot of the conversation. And, they're going to set the agenda. They have their agenda for a lot of things. I'll talk about it in a little bit. But, state-level policy is a really great place to focus on making inroads and things like that. I have a slide at the end that talks about state-level policy, but it's the nice and big shiny object is Congress. Everybody wants to go to Congress. Everyone loves Congress. But your state policy, being able to build relationships at the state level, being able to testify and educate them on issues, that can have almost as big an impact on your practice. Maybe not as fundamental as IRA economics will, but it can have a really big impact on regulation and how your practices operate. So I encourage you to pay attention there. All right, so key takeaways on the IRA. There are good things, right? You cannot say that the out-of-pocket caps and the increased biosimilar reimbursement, things like that, you can't say that those are bad for patients. But as you heard just a second ago from Sarah, the tremendous impact on reimbursement. And operational, how you operate, the cuts to Part B. I've heard one practice talk about it as a practice-ending event. So if this really goes into effect, we will see. And we're lucky. Some other specialties, it truly will be a practice-ending event. Oncology, I think, is a little more tempered. There are some technical fixes, and I'll talk about that. And Matt will probably talk a little bit more about that. Later, but there are technical fixes, and that's a very specific word. Remember that slide I talked about how everyone ran on lowering drug prices? You cannot go into a Democrat's office and say, I want to repeal the IRA because it's not good for me. That immediately their guard goes up and the conversation over then. But as I'll talk about, every piece of legislation, every major piece of legislation does, require a reexamination at a certain point. You need to look at the unintended consequences of what those will do. So the technical fix is the way to approach this. There is a technical fix on the table. It was on the table in the last Congress, but given the political dynamics of the election year and the promises of the IRA, nobody was even willing to really take it seriously and move it forward. And then, the real bottom line, which, that was, Barbara told me that's my job here, is to convince you all that fixing the IRA is about the survival of the independent practice, and I think that is definitely true. Like, this will upend the ecosystem in which we operate and practice, and so we have to fixate on that and focus on it. And I am cautiously optimistic, despite being called a pessimist, I am cautiously optimistic. 2028, Sarah talked about that. When it gets into Part B, that's really, we at COA are always like, why isn't COA making more noise about the IRA? Well, it's kind of like climate change, out of sight, out of mind, right? We'll focus on that when the hurricanes and the flooding start. Well, that's sort of, we'll get to IRA a little bit closer to 2020. Well, now we're in that time. Now we're in that window of where we need to start really making a lot of noise about it and focusing on it. As I said, the political dynamics after the election have changed, so now there's more willingness to discuss how do you reopen it, how do you fix it, what technical fixes you have. I'm not going to spend time going over the drug list, but this is a predicted list that actually Avalier put out. This is the study that Sarah mentioned. This is a study we actually asked Avalier to do for us. 49.5% for oncology, hematology, Part B add-on cut. That is a big cut. And the threat to practice is huge. But it's not just in 2028, because we have let me take a step back, sorry. Also, I don't know if Sarah talked about this, but there's also the commercial spillover, right? This is also another Avalier study, but 60% of payers use an ASP plus contract language. So that minus 49.5%, that'll also spill over into your commercial contracts. So there is a, the entire universe in which people operate is affected by this. And Sarah did talk about the $12 billion cut. So it's not insignificant. I hope the message is being received that we need to act and act soon. So I said, 2028 is far away, but 2026 is here. And we're seeing, in Part D, the community pharmacists put out a study just last week looking at the impact of negotiations on pharmacy operations. And so with those of you with in-office dispensing, this is particularly relevant, right? Because it will change revenue, it will change operations, it will disrupt a lot that's going on there. And you see the issues here: payment delays, cash flow shortfalls, having to float that cash from distribution, and then an annual revenue hit, of $43,000 a year. And when the National Community Pharmacy Association surveyed their practices, 90% of them said that they were not going to stock the IRA drugs when this started happening. So that is an immediate thing. That 2028 feels far away, but 2026 is here. And we're going to also start seeing the 2028 drug list coming out next year. So we have to start planning for how do we manage this, how do we approach this, and where do we go from here. And 2026, as I mentioned, is already here. This is, to me, the elephant in the room for the IRA. This is what really worries me. There's a lot of things worrying. Number one, and it's not even on this list, nobody knows what the IRA does. Does the Inflation Reduction Act scream lower drug prices to you? No. And so, you say Inflation Reduction Act, and you have all these, Sarah had her second slide about what it is. You have infrastructure investment, you have clean energy investment, you have drug price negotiations. There's a lot in there. You have tax cuts. There's a lot in there. And the messaging has just, if you're on the Democrat side, the messaging ever since it has been passed has been absolutely abysmal. A very poor job explaining it, very poor job cutting through the wonkery. But then even worse, the true impact takes years for anyone to feel. This thing was passed as a signature accomplishment, and then the next day everyone's like, okay, when are prices going to go down? When am I going to see new bridges? When am I going to see my tax cuts? And it takes years for that to implement. So that is actually a huge Achilles heel for this, because if people don't see the benefit of law and regulation being passed for them in any short order, they start to question it, and it starts to become a little easier to attack. Also, only directly impacts Medicare beneficiaries. And this actually, sub-bullet stat is also, I told you I'm a big Avalier fan. This also is from Avalier. And I think this is absolutely shocking, the tiny number of Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries that are going to be impacted by the first 10 Part B negotiated drugs, and the cost savings that they will see. So you start to say, well, what's in it for me? Why? And so all these talking heads and all these ads, and you hear, oh, they're raising prices, and they're going to take away your health care. Suddenly they start to resonate, because my prices aren't going down. In fact, over the last 2 decades, with more care shifting to the hospitals, my costs have gone up. My health insurance cost has gone up, which someone was talking about their Part D premiums. This is the lived experience of healthcare in this country is very different than the headlines on press releases that came out of the White House over the last 2 years. And that is what colors Washington right now. When the phone calls to from their constituents come in, that's what they react to. That's what they think. There was a question about the impact on drug development. That is a huge thing. That is something for the manufacturer and pharma side to address. We try not to sort of be the mouthpiece for that, but it's very true. There is no free lunch. That's a line I use in my PBM presentations, but there is no free lunch. Like this, rebates and discounts and all of this money, the math here, like doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of people's pockets, and then they go into a boardroom one day, they take their actuaries, and they say, well, we've got to figure out how to save money and redistribute it so that we're not just constantly losing. And so drug development and discovery is impacted. These last two are sort of also questions about how market dynamics shift. That second or third slide I showed about consolidation and integration and changes there. How is everyone in the marketplace going to react as well? Again, there is no free lunch. So where are they going to push and pull? Are hospitals just going to sit back and say, the ASP that our 340B drug dollars now is calculated on are lower, so we're no longer going to, we're okay with that. We're just going to take a haircut on it. Or are they going to do what they're already doing, which is marking up the price of drugs beyond acquisition cost of 5 to 11 times to their patients? So for those of us with commercial insurance or employer-sponsored insurance, that's going to fall on our shoulders. That's going to fall on everyone's cost of health care. And so the IRA is not as simple as just, okay, pharma take a haircut and everyone move on and we get lower costs. It sort of, this entire marketplace will change and will evolve out of it. And nothing in the IRA talks about 340B, hospitals, or PBMs. Doesn't touch it. So, for 2 decades, we have seen I'm trying to, some backwards, the scissor graph of community oncology going down and hospital oncology going up. And that is because of the market dynamics and the incentives from things like the 340B program, site of service, disparate payments, et cetera. And so we've seen that trend. We've seen health insurance costs go up. We've seen consolidation in the insurance industry, in the hospital industry, in health marketplace, and nothing in the IRA even touches on it and came anywhere close to it. So healthcare costs and this 2 to 3 year, and every year I do this, the time horizon shrinks a little bit, but when I started doing it 4 to 6 years, then it's 3 to 4 years, then it's 2 to 3 years. This time horizon is huge, and people are not experiencing these lower drug costs that they have experienced, that they've seen touted in all of these election campaign ads and in stump speeches and in headlines and in interviews. And at a certain point, when a politician over-promises and under-delivers, what you get is the chaos that we're seeing in Washington today. You see chaos agents because people are unhappy with the status quo, and they throw in the chaos because they like, can't get any worse, right? Let's change things up. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox, but politics is complicated in DC, and it's not as simple as we negotiated lower drug costs. Sarah also had a slide on this, and I think it's very important. There is a belief, okay, the IRA was Biden's signature accomplishment. The last couple of weeks we have seen the Trump administration go in there and roll back all of this regulation and all of this executive orders from Biden. During the first Trump administration, we had a lot of very scary proposals thrown out there. We had his IPI, International Pricing Index, which is international reference pricing. You may have heard President Trump talk about he doesn't like the U.S. being a freeloader. His most favored nation proposal. There was also a Part B demonstration project that was proposed. It's actually been proposed 2 or 3 times through CMMI, and that's something to keep an eye on, and I'll talk about Part B a little bit later. Sarah, I talked about the drug pricing blueprint, has a lot of ideas in it. So even if IRA is solved, the ideas and the concepts behind it are probably not going away. So we need to keep thinking about that, and we need to prepare for what does that world look like differently. All right, solutions. What can we do? That's that everyone it may feel a little powerless based on what I've just said. The technical fix I referenced earlier is removing providers, removing physicians from the middle of drug price negotiations. Our executive director uses a little more incendiary language. He says, stop having doctors be held hostage by the government in drug price negotiations, because in CMS, I wasn't there, but you can sort of peek behind the curtain and say, like, well, why would they have MFP go into ASP? Why would they do that? They would do that because they want to fundamentally restructure how practices operate in the Part B environment and the ASP system. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but there's a lot of interest in doing that. They've been focused on that for a while. So this technical fix, would remove MFP from the ASP calculation. Providers would stay whole, and we all go on to live on the day. The government still gets its negotiated price. Money is still saved, but practices do not suffer the consequences of that 50% reduction in add-on payments. There was a bill in the 118th Congress. We're now in the 119th. The Protecting Patient Access to Cancer and Complex Therapies Act, often shorthand referred to as the Burgess-Barrasso bill. Now that will be changed because some retirements. But it needs to be reintroduced. With lots and lots of conversations. Literally every week I'm talking to people trying to figure out how we go about the strategy for that, because again, that sort of slide about the political balance of power in Washington, you really got to approach the policymakers and the balance there carefully so you're not pissing people off and really ruining your chances of advancing it. As I said, it was very difficult when this was on the agenda last year because Democrats ran on the IRA. Actually, even some moderate Republicans ran on the IRA. This is our signature achievement. Re-elect me. I negotiated lower drug prices for you. And going into those offices and saying, we need to fix the IRA. We've got a problem. They shut down because it's a non-starter. Now we're in a new year. We have this opportunity. And this is what we really should be fighting for right now. This is the most straightforward fix at the moment to that Part B dilemma that we're facing. So it's very, very important that this is where we right now, as it stands, this is what we're going to be spending a lot of time on, and I hope when I talk about advocacy in a minute that you will join us in that. I hinted at this, but this is a side note. So look at this screenshot. Look at the highlighted section here. This is the America First Policy Institute. When President Trump came into office, his landing team, as it were, the transition team, was staffed up by AFPI. This is a think tank. There's a couple of very influential policy think tanks in Washington right now. Paragon is a big one. AFPI is a big one. Yeah, and Heritage Foundation, obviously, that's a thing. But AFPI, this is one of they put out I think it's a 10-chapter policy proposal document. This one is on lowering drug prices. And it's very clear. The doctors in this room are incentivized to prescribe more and more expensive drugs because of the Part B system with ASP plus 6. And so we need to change that. And one of their solutions is shifting high-cost Part B drugs to the Part D ecosystem that more payers can negotiate. This is it's scary to see this from AFPI right now because for so long this has been the purview of sort of the more progressive health policy think tanks in DC. There has been this school of thought that doctors under the Part B system are incentivized to do this and are doing this. And so they've been gunning. That's why you see every couple of years a Part B demonstration project to test out new methods for paying for Part B drugs, AKA getting out of the ASP plus system. And so, it's not an idea that's going away. It's now moving its way into other think tanks. As you see from this, they have the presidents here. They have the HHS and the CMS. And, the headlines are all RFK, Dr. Oz, what are we going to do? They're nice. They're big marquee names. But it is the next 6 levels of deputy administrators at these agencies that are really going to make a difference in what policy advances and how it's rolled out. Those next 6 levels come from AFPI. They come from the Paragon Institute. That's who those staffers are. And they're very smart. They understand the dynamics. They understand our issues. So it's not a lost cause. It's not like this is baked. We as independent providers provide lower cost, high quality, high value care conveniently to patients in a patient-friendly way. They understand this. They know that the system of big integrated single-payer hospitals is not the way that they want to see the system transform. So it's our job to go in there and advocate and educate on those issues. But still, the ASP plus 6 system for so long has survived, but it's not a given. So part of I think what you're going to be doing in your workshops and throughout this and with OnCollege is thinking about how you diversify your practice economics and your revenue streams, different ways to think about it, navigation codes, value-based, different types of contracting strategies. So it's I don't want to say it's a given, but it's a strong possibility that in our lifetimes this system changes very, very dramatically. So think about that and think about how you are building your practice and your economics there. State policy, really quickly, I gave a little shout out for that. I always like this statistic that 20% of state laws pass, whereas federally it's only 3 to 4%. I bet you if I looked at that, this slide I've been using for a few years, if I looked at that number for last year, it'd probably be more like 1%. I mean, Congress, you look at the number of bills that move through Congress, it's just going down and down and down. These are the least productive Congresses, and that's because of partisanship and the schism that's happened over the years. So your states, you have issues like prescription drug affordability boards, that is basically price setting at the state level. You have white and brown bagging bills. You have PBM regulation. You have 340B regulation. That's all happening at the state level and very actively. I mean, just on Friday, there was a 340B bill in New York. Just yesterday, there was a 340B bill in Colorado. So there is a lot happening at your state level. You really should be getting engaged there because it not only is it important there, but it's also then you talk about the implementation of all these laws and regulations and how there's oversight done and how your states operate with them. So pay attention to that. You can see a whole list of different issues here that we're tracking at the state policy level. And you can ostensibly, I think, make a bigger impact than the big shiny object in Washington, D.C. if you go to your state capital. So what can you do? Little audience interaction. How many of you called or emailed an elected official in the last 12 months? I'm guessing about less than half the room here. Well, how long have you been hearing about the IRA? 2 to 3 years. I'm sure you've heard some of the headlines that Sarah and I have shared today. This is scary. How many of you are impacted by PBMs on a day-to-day basis? That's scary, right? Like I could do all these, let's all shake. But your voice is your superpower. You elect them. And so if you are not talking to them and educating on them, or even just engaging with them so they can put a little check mark and say, one more person called me about this issue, then they don't know you exist. And that's sort of the fundamental thing. I can go through a whole lot of things, bring them to your practice, go to Washington, D.C. and lobby with us, go to your state house and lobby with us, get your patients engaged. But even fundamentally, if just everyone in this room picked up the phone one time and sent one email, that's one more data point for your elected officials to think about. And industry, you may think, oh no, that's for, he's talking to the practices. You are all also taxpayers. You all also work for tax-paying businesses. You are all have employees and employers. Your voice matters too. It's just as important. Our life sciences industry is a big part of the economics in this country. So you can all do this. At COA, we have a ton of things we do. We organize 2 big DC Hill Days a year. We have a state policy training. We have a policy training program that focuses on state issues, but everybody can join. Everything is free, by the way, what we do. We do one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, so they're easier for people to attend. We have a patient advocacy network. The patient voice is very important. Your patients have the lived experience of this every day. I also want to say, too, don't let it just be you who's in the room or your one practice leader, although you do always need one person focused on this issue in your practice who's sort of keeping up to date. But diffuse the knowledge, spread it within your practices and within your communities, because numbers matter here. It's very easy for them to get, when you're talking to these elected officials, it's very easy for them to be jaded. Oh yeah, one person came and talked to me about it. But if they got 100 people talking about it, maybe they start thinking twice about these issues. Maybe they start realizing, hey, this is something I need to act on and work on. The fight is not over. We are playing the long game. There's a physician actually here in Texas that I like to listen to. He says advocacy is gentle pressure applied relentlessly. That means don't stop. You can be polite. Always be polite when you're talking to your policymakers, unless they really piss you off, and then tell them what you think. But be polite. But don't give up. Keep pushing, because as I said, the IRA, 2 to 3 years, 3 to 4 years, 4 to 6 years. We have time to continue to push this issue and push the message that this is unacceptable and a technical fix is needed. There is a technical fix on the table, and we can do that. And to sort of bring that home, right? I always like to put this up, how a bill becomes a law in 20 plus simple steps. And this is, you go through this list, right? This takes a long time. Working a bill through Congress is like steering the Titanic. You shifts and turns, but it takes forever to move it around. And so the point of this is that there is a lot of opportunity for you to engage. At every step of this process, there's an opportunity. So if you hear something or if you want to change something, you have to continue to stay involved. You have to be an advocate and push for that. You didn't ask for this fight, but you have to engage. You don't want to be doing this. Everybody wants to be. I hate Washington, honestly. I really do, and I am jaded. As I said in that first slide, I'm a pessimist. But you didn't ask to it, and it's going to have tremendous impact on everything that happens in Washington. Has tremendous impacts, but the IRA in particular, on your practice operations, practice economics, and you can do this. You don't have to be a policy expert. You don't even have to understand all the ins and outs of this slide or what Sarah's talked about, but you have a voice and you can make a difference. And that's sort of one of the fundamental messages that I want to leave you with is please, please, please get engaged. You can do that obviously by staying involved with COA. You can also come to our conference. It's at the end of April in Orlando. And that's always a great time. We have a dedicated advocacy track where we talk about sort of educating on how to engage with your state policymakers, how to engage with your federal policymakers, how to talk to the media. That's always an important thing. But there's also, clinical track, business track, general sessions. It's a really, really great conference. And with that, please, don't ever hesitate to reach out. That's me, actually. I did not do this on purpose, but the same suit and tie. about 18 years ago, 20 pounds heavier. But, please don't be a stranger. I'm happy to talk to anybody. Also answer questions as well, and get involved. Get involved. Get involved.
So let's thank Nick. We do have a few minutes for questions. This is your opportunity to find out what should that message be when we go to Congress and talk to people. We can't say, oh, poor me, because they see us all as rich doctors.
Yeah, you drove up in your Range Rover, remember?
Right. And how do you do that message? How do you focus it on patients, et cetera? Can you give some advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think talking about sort of the entire gamut of how this will impact things if you are no longer there. If, New Mexico Cancer Care is no longer in practice, what's going to happen to your patients? You do a very good job about that. Make it real on the ground, the lived experience. Because I think that's also one of the things that we always run into. We have a program called Sit in My Chair. If you're interested in that, it's sort of a how-to host a member of Congress or their staff in your practice, how to bring them in. So many people everyone's going to be touched by cancer. 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women. Most likely the staffers you're talking to, as I said, they're all very young, so they haven't quite had that lived experience with cancer. But making it real and showing them what it's like in a practice and the operational complexities, and then explaining to them, okay, now you got to drive 60 miles for your cancer care. Now you got to drive, and then you got to pay for parking at the hospital. Now you're going to get a facility fee. Oh, and it's a 340B hospital. That drug cost them $2,000, and they're selling it for $22,000. How do you feel about that? That makes a big thing. They're acutely aware of the healthcare ecosystem writ large. They understand all of the consolidation that's happened. They know that hospitals are growing too big. They know insurers are getting too dominant. And I think I saw a stat actually yesterday that 60% of MSAs are controlled by one dominant hospital and healthcare system. So they understand that, and they want to address that. But then if you go in and say, that's cool, you can do site-neutral payments, you can do 340B reform, but the IRA is going to fundamentally put me out of business, they will recognize that. And you're not going in there and saying, I want to throw the baby with the bathwater out with the bathwater. We have a technical fix, and we can do that. And that 20-step process of how a bill becomes a law, and the slide before it actually, I forgot to say, that's the IRA in paper form. It's big. Every big major piece of legislation gets reopened in Congress. This is not new. This is not novel. This is a totally expected thing to happen. They know this. The Affordable Care Act passed in 2010. We're 15 years later, and we are still figuring out how to fix some of the unintended consequences of that public policy. So there is an opportunity here, and that's what we go in with.
So your greatest fear is that nobody's asking questions and I get to ask them. So as we look at the technical fix, and the goal of the IRA, I thought, was to lower ASP, but the technical fix would preserve ASP and preserve, therefore, our margin for ASP. When I talked to MedPAC, they said, well, you'll buy at MFP and you'll be reimbursed at MFP, but we've already seen that's a lot of decrease in the free cash in your practices. How are we going to convince Congress that preserving ASP should be the technical fix we go for?
All right, I'm not speaking for COA right now. But no, this is a hypothetical scenario that I've played out in my head right now. Okay, you want to lower drug prices, you want to reform the ASP system, that's great. But you can't just do that. You have to talk about practice economics. You have to keep practices whole. And I think that is a message, because people, no, don't ascribe malice when stupidity is really the answer here, right? And so unintended consequences of public policy, it's a lot of words I use, but it just means like they didn't think it through. And you can have a ivory tower academic put out a piece of paper that says Dr. McEnany is incentivized at ASP +6, or really 4.3, as you pointed out. You know, and you can have all these academics, but in the real world, if Dr. McEnany is no longer there, patients are gone. And then you look at the sort of the fundamental economics. We've talked about fixes to the system around this. You know, 340B, et cetera, like those cost the system a lot of money. So, you know, where I said, don't talk about this, like we can talk about negotiating drug prices, you know, whether you like it or hate it, whatever it may be. But you also have to think about the big picture and how this all fits together. Because if you do not do that, you are in for a really painful reality in 2 to 3 years when this all fully kicks in.
Okay, I see one question over here. Go ahead.
Nicolas, this was great. Thank you. I'm a practitioner in Central Illinois, and I'm old. So I remember in 1983, the ASCO Clinical Practice Committee decided that there was no physician work in chemotherapy administration. And since that time, this issue's come up with the AMA and the AMA coding panel. And if you look at what our costs are for delivering chemotherapy and what the reimbursement is, it's a huge delta. And that's really never been addressed. And the AMA's formal position, of course, is that we shouldn't make money on ancillaries. Same thing with the American College of Physicians. So you have, Congress has the ability to pick which medical group they want to listen to keep their costs down versus what's going to actually bankrupt us. So from a policy perspective, where do you see the levers in trying to recoup what's going to be a huge loss? You know, we heard the comment that as long as there's a margin, we're going to be able to be okay, but 1% of the Ohio River is a lot less than 1% of the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to have a lot less coming into the practice that is made up for this tremendous underfunding of what we run. We run small hospitals across the country without being a hospital, and we don't get paid anything for doing that, including, you know, our nurses' time. So where can we come up with an alternative revenue stream that's fair, that's going to never replace totally the margin, but at least come close?
That's the point of this meeting.
That is. That document I referenced early on, the prescription for healthcare reform, that has a lot of policy proposals in there. And I think, you know, you're absolutely right. Like there's a great scissor graph that we put out, actually, again with Avalere. I told you I'd keep citing them. That looked at practice economics, right? And you have medical inflation going up. You know, you've all had to pay your nurses more. Costs of goods and services going up, and you have reimbursement going down, right? We're facing down a physician fee schedule cut this year that we're working to nip in the bud. But you know, fundamentally, it's still a 30 to 30+% cut in real world operating. And so, how do we do that? You know, you come to meetings like this. You advocacy with your members of Congress about sort of the impact of IRA, but also advocacy with your associations, ASCO, AMA, you name them. You know, your voice matters there just as much, and you know, realize that they have also been captured by some other entities as well. So you know, your voice as an independent provider, you don't necessarily have the time. You know, a hospital has someone who's staffed just to go and do these things and engage with them, but you may not have one person in your practice whose only job is to engage with professional associations and come to meetings, but you need to.
We're going to take one more question, and Tony, you win. And then before you do your question, we'll have a 30-minute break. We will reconvene promptly at 10:30, so it'll now be like a 25-minute break. But we're going to have discussions from our manufacturers and from pharma talking about what the effect of the IRA is on them and on research, et cetera. You don't want to miss that. So Tony, give your question, and then we'll let the break.
Tony Blau, I started this company called All for Cure. And the thing that strikes me is that we're always playing defense, always trying to protect terrain. And it seems like this organization has the potential to go on offense in certain contexts. And the context that I have in mind is our company's involved in creating an ecosystem that involves patients, clinicians, and researchers around multiple myeloma, the most expensive of all cancers to treat. It kind of is way outside of every other cancer in EOM and other payment models. we've created a way for oncologists to work together to optimize the care for each individual patient and collectively learn what works better in certain circumstances versus other circumstances. And so by collectivizing our care of patients with multiple myeloma, we can create a new way of advancing the treatment of each patient while optimizing the deployment of these very expensive drugs. And it seems to me like that's something where we can do something positive instead of constantly worrying about the next cut to something.
I agree, and that was, fundamentally the theme of last year's COA conference was stronger together. And that's the concept, right? We are stronger together when we're all working together and collaborating and coordinating. And so I think that's a really important thing.